When I graduated from college, my first job in San Francisco was working for a nonprofit for young adults who were either with an AIDS diagnosis or HIV positive. So I went in the interview figuring, well, let's see if I can get this job. Then they were like, well, tell us your experience with HIV and AIDS. I'm like, well, I'm a person with hemophilia. The room went dead. It was a panel of 8 people. They all looked at me and said, you're a person with what? Then there were a lot of questions of, what is your treatment like? How did you learn how to infuse yourself? What is it like being gay and having hemophilia when the hemophilia community is not that exactly open towards individuals who are gay? There were questions of, how do you deal with it, especially being a person of color in your faith community? So the interview, which was supposed to be half an hour, lasted an hour and a half. By the time finished, they're like, you have the job. I was 11, 12 years old when I found out I was HIV positive. I literally just shut down. It didn't make sense to me at the time. It finally made sense to me when I was 16, 17 years old and went in for a clinic visit. And the social worker at the time would start to get into a conversation. If you're going to have sex, you need to use a condom. And my first question was, well, why? It just didn't clue in. I'm like, you can pull out. And she was like, because you're HIV positive and you have AIDS. I just broke down in the session, and it was the longest day ever. All the walls just fell down. I disclosed my HIV status publicly on a national and international level when I was 18, 19 on a joint video project with the Canadian Hemophilia Society and the National Hemophilia Foundation. I was coming into the gay man that I was at the time. So I was conflicted with both, on the one hand, being in the bleeding disorders community and the community having such staunch issues against HIV and AIDS, and knowing I was also same gender loving. So balancing those two worlds, plus growing up in a very religious family, balancing that world. So all this going on at the same time. So when I had the opportunity, it's like, this is the best venue I can do it in. That was one of the venues where I felt the most comfortable. I was actually able to be free to express all of who I was. With the black church, there was a lot of stigma that if you were gay, you're gonna burn in hell and you're an abomination. So when HIV, AIDS, GRID came into the forefront, from a lot of pulpits, there was preached this message that if you are a person that's gay or have AIDS, that's your fault and you're gonna die. So a lot of African American families who were confronted with their child or their spouse having an AIDS diagnosis, there was no place to turn to. The church was not welcoming or understanding of what was going on. Yes, the church would say, with your bleeding disorder, we can help you, but with the complications of either hepatitis C or AIDS, there was no place to go. And growing up here in San Francisco Bay Area, my original home church was a very staunch African American Baptist church. And I went to the pastor and told him what was going on. And literally he told me not to come back. So then sought out a local church that was open and affirming here in San Francisco that was led by an African American female pastor that dealt head on with the issues of the black church and AIDS, of how do we bring all the worlds together, of how can we propel a message of inclusion, of justice, and a message of hope and healing. It took years for me to go back to my original home church to say, you should have been there for me. There were times within the African American community dealing with AIDS, we would band together at different meetings and talk about, how do we deal with this? That in the mass media, there's a lot of efforts and everything you see is geared towards white males, and that's it. Yet there are issues that are culturally relevant to the African American population that were distinctly different, and getting services that if you were African American with AIDS in San Francisco was hard in the first few years, because they were like, oh, well, you may not need the service right now. Come back when your diagnosis, you're a little sicker, or there are other issues going on. And the African American community with AIDS banded together and formed organizations to serve the community that was culturally relevant, that added in a faith component as well as a family component. Where the community is now, where you have activists from all walks of life, That is where it should have been in the 80s and early 90s, because everyone functioned in their own silo. That if you were an injection drug user, you had your group you stayed with because of your cofactors. You felt comfortable there. What could have happened is if everyone came to the table together, there could have been a unified voice to say this is what community needs overall. That everybody at the table at the same time to have a unified voice. There was nothing that said, let's everybody put down your stigmas and meet at the same place, the same time, because we all are dealing with the same thing. When communities that were affected by AIDS banded together, there started to be a shift overall of open conversation of what our differences are and were. There started to be a shift of saying we need to come to terms with our areas of not understanding each other. We need to own our isms and be transparent with them, be it if we're in a town hall meeting, you don't like me because I'm fat, round, black, white, whatever. You just need to be transparent and real with it. Those who were, quote unquote, in the majority in the AIDS community banded with those who were, quote unquote, in the minority, to where there was a brother and sisterhood that band across all modes of transmission, that regardless of how it happened, you were still a person with HIV or an AIDS and you were valued. The hemophilia community looked at it from the standpoint that if you were gay and you were having unprotected sex, that you knew the risk factors you were taking. That if you were an injection drug user, you chose which drugs to use and which needles to share. Yet we had an FDA sanctioned product to use that was approved by our federal government. That those who knew and were in the know did not let us know what was going on. We didn't have that right to choose. Two young boys with hemophilia, Ricky Ray and Ryan White, became the galvanizing symbol for the hemophilia community around the issue of AIDS in the 80s and 90s. That if we had had a 35-year-old up there, it would have been a different situation, I think, because then they would have said, oh, well, you must have done some things in order to be in this situation. They were, you know, from right around the block. They'd be the kids that your kids will play with. They were innocent victims. They could be put in the media as the forefront of this is what's happening to our community. They were the voice for many of our community who were afraid to come out of the shadows. They were the voice that said, we need change.